Hello and welcome. My name is Todd Culver and I'm the Assistant Director for MARO, the Association of Nonprofit Service Providers Removing Barriers to Community Access, and the host for today's training. Our webinar topic is the Hazard Communication Standard, which is now aligned with the Globally Harmonized System of Classification and Labeling of Chemicals, or GHS. Our presenters today are from MIOSHA's Consultation Education and Training Division. Kristen Osterkamp is a Senior Industrial Hygienist with the SET Division. She provides industrial hygiene-related services to Oakland, Macomb, and St. Clair counties in southeast Michigan. Kristen is a Certified Industrial Hygienist, Certified Safety Professional, and has a Master's in Public Health degree from the University of Michigan. Janelle Thalen is an Industrial Hygienist with the MIOSHA SET Division as well, also serving the southeast Michigan region. Janelle has a Master of Science degree in Industrial Hygiene from the University of Central Missouri. At this time, I will turn it over to Kristen.
Today's training on hazard communication will include the updates made to the 2012 Haz Com standard. This training session is designed to provide information to employees who work with hazardous chemicals and substances. Employers are required to provide training to employees on the changes described in the revised standard by December 1st, 2013. This training includes an overview of the changes to the MIOSHA Haz Com standard, the new labeling requirements, information on the new safety data sheets in the 16-section format, and details of the facility-specific Haz Com program. This portion of the training program is designed to provide guidance to employers on information they must include in order for the employee training program to be compliant with the MIOSHA Haz Com standard. Why the change to Haz Com? The change was made to align with the Globally Harmonized System of Classification and Labeling of Chemicals, GHS, which has been already adopted by 67 nations. Also to provide a common and coherent approach to classifying chemicals, to reduce confusion and increase understanding of the hazard, to facilitate training, and to help address literacy problems, primarily through the use of pictograms. The 2012 revised Haz Com standard was based on GHS Revision 3. Who is affected? Manufacturers, distributors, and importers now have to change the safety data sheet information and the format. They also must change container labeling. Employers have to train their employees on the changes to the safety data sheet, which have now changed from being called MSDSs to SDSs, and the new 16-section format. Also, they must provide training on container labeling, which includes secondary container labeling. Employees have to recognize and understand these hazards based on the information in the new safety data sheet format, the pictograms on container labels, and precautionary and hazard statements that will be on the labels. Other standards affected. These other standards that are also affected are listed here on this slide. Language on the required signs in the listed standards will be harmonized with Haz Com and GHS. For example, the sign for lead will be changed as noted above. Please refer to the signage handout set 5533 or the GHS webpage on the MIOSHA website for additional information on signage requirements. Note that label requirements for substance-specific standards must be completed on or by June 1st, 2015, and signage requirements must be updated by June 1st, 2016. Other additional standards affected are listed here. In some cases, the definitions may have changed in the standards listed above. Please refer to handout set number 5532 or the GHS page on the MIOSHA website for additional information on the other standards affected. Effective dates and requirements. By December 1st, 2013, employers must train their employees on the new label elements and safety data sheet format. June 1st, 2015, compliance is expected with all modified provisions of the final rule except with the exceptions noted below. Effective on or by June 1st, 2015, all safety data sheets must be completed and shipped or sent to users with the first order shipped on or after this date. All safety data sheets received on or after June 1st, 2015 must be in the new format. And vertical chemical-specific standards with label requirements must be changed to harmonize with the revised Haz Com standard as well. December 1st, 2015, the distributor shall not ship containers labeled by the chemical manufacturer or importer unless it is a GHS label. June 1st, 2016, we must have everything updated, including updating alternative workplace labeling and Haz Com programs as necessary, and provide additional employee training for newly identified hazards, and affected vertical standard-specific signage must be in place. Chemical classifications. Chemicals are now being classified using a harmonized system that provides standardized language for health hazard categories, physical hazard categories, and environmental hazard categories. Previously, chemical hazards were evaluated in a more subjective manner. Chemicals must now go through a specific prescriptive classification process to determine which hazards are present and which hazard and precautionary statements apply. This can be a lengthy process. Now, MIOSHA does not regulate the environmental hazard categories. That is done by the Department of Environmental Quality, DEQ, and their contact information can be found in the speaker notes of this presentation. As far as chemical classifications, there are 10 health hazard classifications, and these are each further defined and described in Appendix A of the Haz Com standard. And they are acute toxicity, skin corrosion/irritation, respiratory or skin sensitization, germ cell mutagenicity, carcinogenicity, reproductive toxicity, specific target organ toxicity, single exposure, specific target organ toxicity, repeated exposure, aspiration, or simple asphyxiants. So these are further defined and described in Appendix A of the Haz Com standard, and this Appendix A is used by manufacturers, importers, and distributors to determine if any of their products are classified as a health hazard. And Appendix A is also used to determine the severity of that hazard or hazard category under the applicable hazard class. More information is noted on the next slide. Also note that the last one listed here, simple asphyxiants, that was not part of the current GHS International Standard, but was specifically included by OSHA as a hazard classification under the 2012 Haz Com standard. This chart shows the new health hazard classes and the hazard categories that correspond to each of the health hazard classes. A hazard category of 1, which we see in the column furthest to the left in the chart, is the most hazardous. Hazard categories become less severe as you move to the right in the chart. Manufacturers, importers, and distributors must classify all hazards for their products. Besides health hazards, additionally, there are physical hazards that have classifications, and each of the chemical physical classifications are further defined and described in Appendix B of the Haz Com standard. Appendix B is to be used by manufacturers, importers, and distributors to determine if any of their products are classified as a physical hazard. If the product is classified as a physical hazard in one or more of these physical hazard classifications, Appendix B is used to determine the severity of the hazard or hazard category. Some of these include explosives, flammable aerosols, oxidizing gases, gases under pressure, which would include compressed gases, liquefied gases, refrigerated liquefied gases, and dissolved gases. Additional chemical classifications for physical hazards are listed here, and they include flammable liquids, solids, self-reactive chemicals, pyrophoric liquids and pyrophoric solids or gases, self-heating chemicals, and chemicals which in contact with water emit flammable gases. And lastly, the additional physical hazard classifications include oxidizing liquids, oxidizing solid, organic peroxides, corrosive to metal, and combustible dusts. Note, pyrophoric gases and combustible dusts were not part of the GHS International Standard, but were specifically included by OSHA and MIOSHA as a physical hazard classification under the 2012 Haz Com standard. This chart shows the physical hazard classes and hazard categories that correspond to each of the physical hazard classes. The hazard category shown furthest to the left in the table is the most hazardous, and the hazard categories become less severe as you move to the right in this chart. Manufacturers, importers, and distributors must classify all hazards for their products. Labels. There are several new label elements. Symbols will now be found on labels called pictograms. You will see something called signal words possibly on a new label, hazard statements, precautionary statements, product identification, and supplier manufacturer information. This is an example of the new label style that is to appear on product labels beginning no later than June 1st, 2015, or December 1st, 2015 for distributors who still have a product in inventory after the June 1st, 2015 deadline. The type of required information is noted in blue. The actual statements and information will vary depending on the specific health and physical classification of the product. Shipping labels. Effective June 1st, 2015, all shipping labels will be required to have all GHS label elements. Note the difference in the shipping label compared to the container label on the previous slide. The Department of Transportation, DOT, requires that additional information be noted on shipping containers. See the bottom right corner of this shipping label. MIOSHA requires that employees are knowledgeable of both the container and shipping labels. Here we see the transport pictograms, and this was a chart here that we obtained from the GHS guide on the OSHA website. These are DOT labels, and they may appear on transport containers depending on the classification of the chemical. Employers are required to train employees on shipping container labels they may encounter on the job. DOT and MIOSHA labels. The DOT labels may take precedence over similar GHS pictograms for shipping containers. DOT does not have labels that correspond to the health hazard or the acute toxicity, less severe hazard, which is noted with an exclamation point. DOT does not view the GHS pictograms as being posing any kind of conflict, and it is permissible to have the DOT and GHS pictograms for representing the same hazard, or the DOT one may take precedence. As far as on these labels, we're going to start seeing pictograms. This is new. There are 9 pictograms. Only 8 are regulated by MIOSHA, and the 9th one is the environmental hazards pictogram. So here we see the health hazard pictograms as well as the physical hazard pictograms and the environmental hazard pictogram. The 3 pictograms specific to health hazards are the exclamation point, the health hazard pictogram, which is the silhouette of a person with a starburst on the chest, and the skull and crossbones. There also is the corrosive pictogram, which can represent both physical and health hazards. And then the 4 pictograms to the right of the environmental pictogram, the exploding bomb, the flame over the circle representing an oxidizer, and the gas cylinder are specific to physical hazards. As far as the environmental pictogram noted with DEQ, you can contact the DEQ for additional information using the speaker notes associated with this presentation. Going into greater detail on the pictograms for health hazards, the following slides will give you a little bit more information on them. What we see here, the skull and crossbones pictogram, represents an acute toxicity severe hazard, and acute means a short-term effect. The exclamation point pictogram represents acute toxicity but less severe, and it can also represent something that's an irritant, a dermal sensitizer, an acute toxicity harmful category, or narcotic effects, or a respiratory tract irritant. Additional information for labeling and the associated language associated with these pictograms can be found in Appendix C of the Haz Com standard. Here we see the corrosive pictogram, and it can represent skin corrosion, serious eye damage or irritation. The pictogram on the right is called the health hazard pictogram, and it is represented by the silhouette of a person with a starburst across the chest. And this is used to indicate that the substance is a chronic and or a target organ hazard. So it may be a carcinogen, a respiratory sensitizer, a reproductive toxin, or have target organ toxicity, mutagenicity, or pose an aspiration hazard. Looking at the pictograms for physical hazards, here we see the exploding bomb, which can represent explosives, self-reactives, or organic peroxides. The flame pictogram represents flammables, self-reactives, pyrophorics, self-heating, emits flammable gas, or organic peroxides. As mentioned earlier, the corrosive pictogram can represent a physical hazard, being corrosive to metals. The cylinder pictogram shows gases under pressure, and the circle with the flame above it represents an oxidizer. Oxidizers are chemicals that can emit oxygen and increase the risk of fire. At this point, I will turn the presentation over to Janelle, who will tell you more about the changes to labeling requirements.
Thank you, Kristen. Now we're going to talk about the additional elements to the labels, including the signal word. These are words used to indicate the severity of the hazard and alert employees to the potential hazard. There are only two signal words that may appear on the label. One is danger, which represents a more severe hazard. The other is warning, indicating a less severe hazard. Not all labels will have a signal word. Some chemicals are not hazardous enough to require that a signal word appear on the label. Hazard statements, another part of the label. They are specific hazard statements that must appear on the label based on the chemical hazard classification. Examples of these hazard statements are flammable liquid and vapor, causes skin irritation, may cause cancer. Precautionary statements, another element that will be present on the label. These are recommended measures, and they appear in 4 different areas: prevention, response, storage, and disposal. Examples of precautionary statements would be wear respiratory protection, wash with soap and water, store in a well-ventilated place. Please note that these are not a mandate for employees to follow, but recommendations based on the classification. The only way that you will know for sure if you're required to wear a respirator, for example, is if your employer has provided you with information related to your chemical exposure on the job. There are permissible exposure limits for several chemicals that would determine whether or not you are required to wear a respirator. Please discuss this with your employer to determine whether or not a respirator may be required. The identification of the product is another component of the label. The product identification, such as a product name, as well as the supplier identification, which includes the address and the telephone number for the manufacturer, importer, or distributor. Other information may also be included on the label, such as the physical state, if it's a solid, liquid, gas, the color, hazards not otherwise classified, route of exposure, storage and disposal, hazard prevention, and emergency response instructions. Here's an example of a label with each of the label components identified. You can see the 2 pictograms that are represented for flammable and acute toxicity severe. The product identifier, in this case, Toxiflam. The signal word is danger. the hazard statements, toxic if swallowed, flammable, liquid, and vapor. Several precautionary statements are also listed for this fictitious chemical. Supplier information is also included, as well as supplemental information on this label. There have been several questions and concerns related to changes to secondary container labels. The requirements for secondary containers, this would be workplace labels when you take the product out of the original manufacturer's container and you put it into another container. And if that container is used or stored, or if the employee sets that down and leaves or hands it to another employee, this would be under the workplace labeling. This is an excerpt from the Hazard Communication Standard, Section F, number 6. Workplace labeling, except as provided in paragraphs 7 and 8 of this section, the employer shall ensure that each container of hazardous chemicals in the workplace is labeled, tagged, or marked with either the information specified under paragraphs 1I through V of this section for labels on shipped containers, which would be the original manufacturer's GHS label. Or it may also be labeled with product identifier and words, pictures, symbols, or combination thereof, which provide at least general information regarding the hazards of the chemicals, and which, in conjunction with other information immediately available to employees under the Hazard Communication Program, will provide employees with specific information regarding the physical and health hazards of the hazardous chemical. For example, an HMIS or NFPA or other type of labeling system that is developed by the employer. Secondary containers. This must be consistent with the revised Haz Com standard. No conflicting hazard warnings or pictograms may appear on secondary containers. You may use written materials, signs, placards, etc., in lieu of affixing a label to individual stationary process containers. Employers can use GHS compliance labels, which would be the same as the shipping container label. Examples below include the HMIS label and the NFPA label. The HMIS label includes a section under health where you can include an asterisk next to the numerical representation of the hazard. An asterisk on the HMIS label indicates that that has a chronic or target organ effect. The NFPA label, however, does not include information in the numerical notations related to chronic or target organ effects. Please ensure that if you are using the NFPA label that you also include notations related to chronic health effects or target organs. Safety data sheets. Under the new Haz Com standard, material safety data sheets are now called safety data sheets. All safety data sheets will have a consistent 16-section format, which we will be reviewing in the next few slides. Employers must ensure that SDSs are readily accessible to employees. The new 16-section standardized format follows the ANSI Z400.1. You can see each of the sections that are identified below. There are sections 1 through 11, then there are sections 12 through 15, which are not regulated or under the jurisdiction of MIOSHA. Then there are section 16, which is also regulated by MIOSHA, and we will be going through each one of these in more detail. Section 1 of the safety data sheet will contain information on the identity of the chemical on the safety data sheet, as well as the recommended uses. It will also provide essential contact information for the supplier. Section 2 includes the hazard identification. This is where the GHS classification notations will be present on the safety data sheet. Also, appropriate warning information associated with those hazards. This is essentially what would appear on the label of the original manufacturer's container. Section 3, the composition ingredients. This identifies the specific ingredients contained in the product indicated on the safety data sheet. This would include impurities, stabilizing additives, information on substances, mixtures, and all chemicals where a trade secret is claimed. In Section 4, you will find the first aid measures. This will be consistent on every safety data sheet. In Section 4 is where employees can look to find first aid measures that should be followed, which describes the initial care that should be given by untrained responders to an individual who has been exposed to the chemical. Section 5 is firefighting measures. And this provides recommendations for firefighting caused by the chemical if there is a fire. In Section 6, this would cover the accidental release measures and provides recommendations related to appropriate responses to spills, leaks, or releases. For example, proper cleanup practices. Response for large versus small spills if there is a difference in how those spills are handled. Section 7 is related to handling and storage and provides guidance on safe handling practices and conditions for safe storage of the chemicals, such as chemical incompatibility information. In Section 8, exposure controls and personal protective equipment. So this is where you would find the OSHA permissible exposure limits. Please note that in Michigan, we have our exposure limits which may be different from federal OSHA. Please refer to the MIOSHA air contaminant standard, either Part 301 for general industry or 601 for construction, related to the exposure limits for Michigan OSHA. Engineering controls information will also be here, as well as the type of personal protective equipment that should be worn by the employee to minimize exposure. Section 9 includes physical and chemical properties. This would be something such as the pH, the flash point, or other physical and chemical properties associated with that chemical. Section 10 is stability and reactivity, which describes the reactivity hazards of the chemical and the chemical stability information, such as reactivity, chemical stability, or other. Section 11 includes toxicological information and identifies toxicological and health effect information, or indicates that data is unavailable if there was no testing performed. Section 12 through 15 contains information for concerns that are outside of the jurisdiction of MIOSHA. For instance, for the EPA or DEQ requirements, for transport or DOT requirements, and Section 15 for other regulatory information. For instance, California-specific rules or Northeast Governor rules that may appear, and other local requirements may be in Section 15. Section 16 is for other information and indicates when the safety data sheet was prepared or the last known revision was made. This is also where you may find the HMIS or NFPA label information if the manufacturer, importer, or distributor chooses to provide this for the product. The SDS may also state where the changes have been made to the previous version. In Michigan, we have some specific posters that are required by Act 154, our MIOSHA Act. The first poster is related to informing the employee where the safety data sheets are located in the workplace. This poster must be posted within the work environment and will tell you where to find the safety data sheets and who is responsible for maintaining those safety data sheets. The second poster is related to new or revised safety data sheets. If there is a chemical that's received or a new safety data sheet for a chemical that's being used, this will be noted on this poster. This must be posted for 10 working days upon receipt of the new or revised safety data sheet. So have you completed the training? Maybe. It depends upon whether or not your employer has provided additional information to you prior to receiving training through this webinar. The employer must have provided you with details of the facility-specific hazard communication program, such as the location and availability of the written program and safety data sheets, specific information related to chemicals in the facility, and their physical hazards, their health hazards, and hazards not otherwise classified by GHS. They must also include a chemical list, location, and where the hazardous chemicals are being used in the facility, the secondary container labeling system that may be used within the facility, specific procedures to follow to protect employees from the chemical hazards, methods used to detect the presence or release of a hazardous chemical, such as sensors, alarms, odors, visual effects, or monitoring devices. In this case, you may have some businesses that may have something like a carbon monoxide detector present in an area where there is a possible release for carbon monoxide. This would be an example of a sensor or an alarm that may be present in your work environment. Federal OSHA has several resources that are available on their website, which is www.osha.gov. When you go to the home page, they will have a dedicated link for the new Haz Com GHS requirements. There is regulatory information, including the final rule, the hazard communication comparison between the old standard and the new standard, and frequently asked questions. There's also guidance documents such as OSHA briefs, there's fact sheets, and there's quick cards which can be used for providing additional training and information to employees. They also have a wallet card that's recently been made available for employers to use to give to employees for training and reminder. Michigan OSHA also has resources available on our website, which is www.michigan.gov/MIOSHA. When you get to our home page, if you go down to the section entitled Initiatives, the Hazard Communication GHS Initiative will be listed there, and will take you to the website where all the MIOSHA resources are located for GHS and the new Haz Com standard. As Kristen mentioned earlier, there are several handouts available related to other standards that may be affected by the GHS and changes to Haz Com, including signage changes and language changes for chemical-specific standards. We have DVDs and videos that are available. We also have this training program available not only in the webinar format, but we also have it available as a PowerPoint presentation that an employer can use to train employees. This includes extensive speaker notes. The program and the presentation is identical to what you've seen today. In summary, this training program has provided to you an overview of the changes to the MIOSHA Part 42, 92, and 430 Hazard Communication Standard, or Haz Com, the new labeling requirements and safety data sheet format with the 16 section categories, the details of the facility-specific hazard communication program may be provided to you as supplemental to this training program, and other resources that are available to assist. If you have questions, feel free to contact MIOSHA for information or assistance. You can see our MIOSHA Consultation Education and Training program. Our address is listed there. Our telephone number is 517-322-1809. And of course, you can always access information and request assistance through our website, www.michigan.gov/MIOSHA. I would like to thank Mauro for hosting this webinar, and this concludes the presentation. Thank you.